Welcome to the Project Success webinar, The Case for Presuming Competence in Students with Significant Disabilities. There will be a slight delay here on my first slide switching over, but today we're going to be talking about how we can improve student outcomes by bringing together three related elements that sort of all come together when we're talking about improving student outcomes, especially those students with the most significant disabilities. The first of those elements is presumed competence, so assuming that there is ability within the student. The second element is high expectations, so having high expectations for our students with the most significant disabilities. And the last element is the idea of the least dangerous assumption, and we'll talk about all three of these things in more detail here in just a bit. First, we'll talk about some assumptions. So warning, assumptions ahead. We all do it. We all do it about all sorts of things, make assumptions, but when it comes to our students with significant disabilities, we don't know what we don't know. We think we know, but we don't. So let's examine some flawed assumptions regarding students with significant disabilities. The first flawed assumption is that intelligence is something that can be reliably measured. That's false. Of course, intelligence can be measured, but the reliability of that is something that is fairly questionable at this point. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. The second flawed assumption is sort of in two parts. Firstly, that students with intellectual disabilities can't learn gen ed academic content. False. But if you go off of that premise, then you might also believe there's no benefit for them to be in gen ed. If they can't learn the content, why should they even be in the gen ed setting? Both of those pieces are false. Students with intellectual disabilities can indeed learn general education academic content, and there is a benefit to being in gen ed classes, even just beyond the academics that are going on in those classes. The last flawed assumption is that the choice between a student being in gen ed or getting their needs met is an either-or situation. That again is false. So a student can be in gen ed full-time or part-time and get their needs met at the same time. It's not an either-or. We can find a way to do both. For more information on these flawed assumptions and how the author Cheryl Jorgensen proposes to address them, you can check out her book, It's More Than Just Being In. It's really a great resource for teachers of students with significant disabilities. So let's go back to that first assumption about being able to reliably measure intelligence. We know that a student is diagnosed with an intellectual disability if they score below a 70 on an IQ test and also exhibit some deficits in adaptive functioning. But let's look at what that means to have a score of below 70. So the IQ test itself was first developed in 1904, so we're already working with a test that's more than 100 years old. And its purpose at that time was to help identify students who were most likely to experience difficulties in school and need specialized assistance. Okay, sounds okay so far. The way that they did that to identify students who needed those the specialized assistance was to compare what they determined the student's mental age to be, as determined by the test, and they compared that to the student's chronological age in years. And if the mental age was found to be below the chronological age, that classified that student as retarded. And of course, we don't use that term anymore, but the underlying definition of that word is being delayed or held back in terms of progress, development, or accomplishment. So in a way, we can see where that came from. If a student's mental age is below or lower than their chronological age, there's something going on there that is delaying them, that is holding them back in terms of their progress, development, or accomplishment. Now, what that doesn't mean, though, when a student has been found to be in that classification, is that the student is incapable or incompetent. When we consider a student's IQ versus their achievement, you'll see this graph to the right here is a distribution of scores on an IQ test and scores on an achievement test. So for any given IQ score along the x-axis, half of students will obtain achievement scores along the y-axis at or below the IQ score, or what's expected for their IQ score. okay? But what that means is the other half of students will obtain achievement scores above what is expected for their given IQ score. So let's say if we're discussing a group of students who all have an IQ of 100, fully half of those students will get achievement scores below what we would expect for a student with an IQ of 100. But the other half of the students will score above what we would expect a student with an IQ of 100 to get. So again, another important point to keep in mind for our students who have been diagnosed with an intellectual disability based solely on this one data point. Moving on to the least dangerous assumption. Given what we've talked about the IQ test, the least dangerous assumption for our students is to presume competence in them. And so now we're going to start joining the least dangerous assumption and presumed competence. So just to give a little more definition to it, the idea of the least dangerous assumption has been around in research for quite some time, and I included this specific quote to demonstrate it's been around since at least the mid-'80s. But in general, the idea is that in the absence of conclusive data, so when we don't know any better or aren't able to figure out any better in a given moment, whatever educational decisions we make should be based on things that if we do them and we end up being wrong about what we believe about the student, it will have the least dangerous or least harmful effect on their ability to function independently in the future. So that gives us sort of two scenarios to consider. We could assume that students can learn. What if we assume students can learn? So we give them every opportunity because we have a belief. We start off by believing that they can learn, and so we give them the opportunities to learn. And it turns out they can't. They truly have the most significant cognitive disabilities and interferences going on, and they just simply can't. Okay, what happens if we assumed that they could learn, we tried our best, gave them every opportunity, and it turns out they can't? Well, no real harm done to that student, and really no harm done to us as well. Maybe some quote-unquote wasted time, but the ultimate impact on a student being able to function independently because we gave them plenty of opportunities to try to learn, their independence won't be affected by that. On the flip side, what if we assume from the beginning that students can't learn? We see a kind of a low IQ score and we think, okay, I know what this means, they can't learn, so we automatically just don't give them every opportunity to learn. We set them up for low expectations, and it turns out they can. What if we assume the student can't learn, but it turns out they can? Maybe they have a significant communication disability or processing disorder, or even a physical challenge that they're able to overcome or find some sort of assistive technology or something like that. What if we had started off assuming that that student couldn't learn, and then we find out that they can? That will have a much more harmful effect on their ability to function independently later in life. So, to sum up, the least dangerous assumption for our students is to have high expectations, and really to have high expectations for all students. The worst thing that can happen is that the student doesn't meet our high expectations, but they've at least made efforts to get there, and that's not so bad at all. So, I told you we were going to start bringing together least dangerous assumption and presumed competence, and I think this slide does a nice job of summing it up for us. When we're not sure what students can learn, we're going to presume competence and presume that they have the ability to learn. And it's our job to find a way to make that happen. Just because they may not be learning in a more traditional sense doesn't mean that they're not able to learn. And so it's our job as special educators to find a way to help them learn. Any student who has a difficulty with demonstrating their ability to learn, that shouldn't be taken as evidence of their incompetence. So really to sum that up, the absence of evidence. So if we don't have evidence that a student can learn, that isn't the same thing as having evidence of absence, which is evidence that they cannot learn. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Kind of deep, but something that sticks with me. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. So let's talk more about presuming competence. When we presume competence in our students, we influence a variety of things. We influence how actively we engage the student, whether we're constantly trying to draw them into what's going on around them or whether we just sort of let them sit quietly to the side. We influence the complexity of information and materials that we offer them. So if we're presuming competence in our students, we're going to present them with some more complex information and some more involved materials. We influence how engaged the student is in their education. We often say, if you as a teacher are bored with what you're teaching these students, they're probably bored hearing it. You can only learn your colors and your letters and your numbers for so long and hear about that for so long before you just totally disengage. So by presuming competence and by putting some more complex information in front of the students, we are influencing how engaged they are in their education. When we presume competence, we influence how often we talk to the student and what kind of tone we use. It's easy, especially for our students with more significant communication challenges, to forget that we are still a communication partner with them. We can still talk to them and have communications and conversations. And also that we need to be using a respectful tone and not a tone that is maybe indicative of a younger age than the student really is and things like that. So again, when we presume competence in our students, we are showing that we value interaction with the student by talking to them more often and by using a respectful tone. We also influence how we speak about the student to others rather than sort of limiting them and only referring to them by their challenges and their category of disability and things like that. We're going to speak to others about the student in more respectful and more descriptive terms rather than just sort of relying on categories or labels. And lastly, when we presume competence, we're influencing how much effort and patience we ourselves use to resolve challenges rather than just giving up pretty easily. Oh, that's kind of tricky. I don't know how I'm going to get them to understand that concept, or I don't know how I'm going to be able to find a way for this student to access this activity. If we're presuming incompetence, it's real easy for us to give up on that. But when we decide that we're going to presume competence in our students, we're influencing ourselves and we're giving ourselves permission to put in more effort and have more patience to resolve some of these challenges and truly be able to provide access to our students with significant disabilities. So presuming competence in our students is game-changing. Let's think about LRE for a bit and what all this means with presuming competence and having high expectations and what this means when we're providing access to gen ed. The Dear Colleague letter states that under the law, under IDEA, in order to make FAPE available to children with disabilities, the child's IEP must be designed to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the gen ed curriculum. So it says right there in the law and in the Dear Colleague letter that students with disabilities should have the opportunity to be involved in and make progress in the gen ed curriculum. Now, there was a time where providing access to students with disabilities meant making sure they were physically in the classroom, right, providing that physical access, and then that was considered inclusion. When we had a student with a disability in a general education classroom, we all patted ourselves on the back and said, good for us, we provided access. And that certainly is a key piece of including students with disabilities. However, we're moving beyond that now and seeing that there's another part to that, which is providing intellectual access, so access to the actual content that's being taught in the curriculum. When those two things come together, when we have physical access to the gen ed setting and intellectual access to the gen ed content and curriculum, that is where we truly have inclusion for our students with the most significant disabilities. A little access goes a long way. So when we're talking about access to gen ed, both physically and intellectually, the important piece about that is we're wanting to provide this access because we know that it leads to participation in the gen ed setting, in the gen ed content and curriculum, and when students participate, then that leads to learning, and that's what we ultimately want for our students with significant disabilities. So we start with the access, work up to participation, and eventually get to learning. The way our students with significant disabilities learn and what we should focus on when we're instructing them can sort of be visualized by this target here. So students have the right to be exposed to grade level gen ed content, but they also still need to be working on mastering skills that are at or near their ability level. So that dark blue circle in the middle, that's showing that we're really honing in on students being able to master skills that are at or near their ability level and sort of stair-stepping our way up as they master these skills. But that lighter blue circle around the outside indicates to us that students also need to be exposed to the grade level gen ed content. We won't require necessarily mastery of that grade level gen ed content, but they have the right to be exposed to it. And we don't know what those students could be taking in just by being exposed to it. The little asterisk there indicates that the idea of exposure to gen ed content at grade level is for our students with the most significant disabilities. For students who have mild cognitive disability, they should still be working towards mastery of the grade level standards. No one rises to low expectations. So keeping this idea of mastery versus exposure in mind, it's important to remember that if we are having low expectations where we're just sort of, we're just going to sort of expose them to some stuff, but we don't really have a high expectation of mastery, or we don't even have a high expectation that they may glean something out of being exposed to the grade level gen ed content, that's having low expectations, and our students won't rise to those low expectations. So we as educators have to be okay with having high expectations even without the satisfaction of sort of seeing it to fruition. So we may work and work and work our tails off, having high expectations, presenting, more complex content, and not really seeing any results, or think that we don't see any results, or maybe we don't see it this year, but we see it next year, or maybe we as an elementary teacher don't see it, but it makes it pays dividends in middle school or in high school that we've exposed students to this content. So we have to be okay with having those high expectations and possibly not seeing the end result of those high expectations. Instead, though, we can think about the power of yet, the word yet. So we may say, the student can't do X, Y, Z. They can't do X, Y, Z yet. So our job is to figure out how to build a bridge to that yet. Maybe they can't do X, Y, Z right now, but how can we find a way to get them there? The way we do that is by presuming competence. We presume that there's an ability in there somewhere, and then we find that competence. Here's an example of the power of expectations. So this is regarding students with disabilities in Kansas. After changing the state standards and the requirements so that students in special education participated in the state assessment, so previously students with disabilities did not participate in the state assessment, when they made that change and required students to participate in the assessment, the state of Kansas reported that the percent of fifth graders with disabilities who were proficient in reading increased from 26% in 2000 to nearly 50% in 2003. So in just 3 years, the percentage of students with proficiency in reading doubled. That's amazing. And that's simply because they were being included in the state assessment. That brought up higher expectations for those students, but also higher expectations for their teachers, that the expectation was there that they were being taught grade level content. And then sure enough, these assessments reported that students were making progress in that material. In math, fourth graders with disabilities increased their proficiency from 36% to 58% over a 4-year period. So same kind of sentiment. Gen ed placement and gen ed exposure to the curriculum and the content, even if it's not in the gen ed setting, correlates to improved learning outcomes for our students. So it's important that we have high expectations both for our students and for ourselves. That idea of high expectations, of course, it comes through in the Every Student Succeeds Act, it comes through in the Dear Colleague letter, but it also just comes through in plain old research that shows truly the result of having those high expectations. It's not just the law, sort of, someone wrote this law and they don't really know what they're talking about. It is supported by research as well. So when we expect students to learn, when we expect them to learn, not just when we're surprised, whoa, they learned something, but when we expect them to learn, they are more likely to do so. It doesn't mean that it guarantees success when we have these high expectations, and certainly not necessarily guaranteeing success on the same level as non-disabled peers, but having these high expectations does give students with significant disabilities a much better chance of at least getting closer to that target. Students can't learn what they're not taught. If we automatically assume they can't learn something so we don't teach it to them, then they are automatically never going to learn it. But if we take a chance and find a way to make a concept or a topic accessible, they might learn it. They might not. They might still not learn it. That will happen. But they might learn it. And I think it's worth that chance to take that they may learn the more complex content. So let's think a little bit about what does it look like and what does it sound like to have high expectations, to presume competence in our students with significant disabilities. Inclusion in gen ed settings to the maximum extent appropriate. We've talked about that a little bit already. Certainly there are some students who it's not appropriate or perhaps not safe for them to be in a gen ed setting full time. But wherever and whenever possible, when students are able to be included in the gen ed setting, their outcomes improve. It also sounds like, presuming competence and having high expectations sounds like us using language when we're describing this student that focuses on their abilities and their needs rather than classification. I touched on that earlier. So rather than just sort of giving a pat label to, oh, this student has a severe cognitive disability, and assuming that we know what that means just from that label, let's really talk about their specific abilities and their specific needs so that we can find ways to address those. Also looks like providing all students with a means to communicate about the same academic and social topics as their peers without disabilities. So just because a student has difficulties with communication doesn't mean that they can't communicate about the same kinds of academic and social topics. They should have that same opportunity, and we need to find a way to provide that means of communication to them. Presuming competence and holding high expectations also looks like having annual IEP goals that reflect gen ed content standards as well as functional skills. No one is saying that we need to throw the functional skills out the window. We, of course, still want our students to be working towards being as independent as possible functionally, but their annual IEP goals need to reflect gen ed content standards as well. Another way that we presume competence sounds like when we speak directly to students rather than speaking around them or through paraprofessionals or other assistants. When we speak directly to a student, even if they're not able to respond back to us in a traditional way, we are communicating to that student that they have value and that we see them, and that we know that they have something to say, even if it's not coming out in that moment or in the way that we might expect. Lastly, presuming competence in our students sounds like using age-appropriate vocabulary, topics, and inflection. So we're not going to sort of use a babyish tone of voice. We're not going to use younger vocabulary. We're going to challenge our students with age-appropriate vocabulary and topics. To sum that up, I think it's important to remember that a student's past lack of progress doesn't justify us as educators ceasing to try. So we don't come to a point where, the student, they just haven't made progress in anything that we've been trying or whatever, so we're just going to stop trying. I see now they've peaked, they're done, and we're just going to sort of ride it out. Nope, that's not what's in the best interest of our students. We're going to keep trying. Here are some ways that these high expectations look in practice in a classroom, and it's divided out into academic and social-emotional ways that we reflect high expectations. So on the left side are ways that we show the high expectations, and then on the right side are some ways that we might be demonstrating low expectations to our students. Things like providing more wait time indicates to a student, again, that we believe that they have something valuable to say and that we're willing to wait for them to find a way to say it. We make more eye contact. That's a way that we're showing that we are, paying attention to our students and knowing that they have something to contribute to the classroom. Other ways that we show high expectations academically, we ask more challenging questions, we use more complex modes of presentation and evaluation, we call on students more often rather than just either depending on students to indicate when they're ready to answer or just not even looking for answers at all from students and sort of just teaching as we go. We're going to call on them. We're going to smile at them. We're going to delve into their answers more deeply. So rather than just accepting a surface answer, we're going to sort of dig into that a little more. And I won't spend a lot of time on that right side about reflecting low expectations, but you can imagine if we're not really giving the students wait time, if we're asking them much simpler questions, really giving them simple modes of presentation and evaluation, all of these things, they sort of reflect to the student, there's not much, there's not much here in me. I don't have much to offer, so I don't feel very engaged in what's going on. It's important to stick to that high expectation side. So these are some quotes that I think help make the case for presuming competence in our students. These quotes come from an elementary teacher of a self-contained classroom for students with moderate disabilities. It just goes to show that the impact of presuming competence for her has gone beyond, the doors of her classroom. It's reached out, and those impacts have reached her students' parents, they've reached other students, and they've reached teachers around the school. The entire school has been impacted by this one teacher's decision to presume competence in her students. So you can see here she says, when she decided to make this decision that I'm going to teach with presumed competence, it's changed not only her students, but their parents, the paraprofessionals, and the whole school, how the whole school views her class. She tells a story about running into a parent at the store, and this parent told her how shocked she was to see her daughter reading at home. This mother had believed that her daughter would never be able to read or understand at a higher level. And just because this teacher made the decision to presume competence in her students, this student has made progress in reading and made progress in being able to understand at a higher level, and that parent was just shocked. So imagine what would have happened if this teacher had taken sort of the easy way out or had taken that lack of past progress and said, oh, I guess we're just where we're at. We're not going to progress any further. We would have missed that opportunity for this child to be able to read and understand at a higher level. And this last quote, I think, really just sums it up all together. Once she decided to just teach and let her students just learn, they began to flourish in ways she never predicted. Pretty powerful stuff. So, sort of to wrap things up here, in conclusion, having high expectations does not necessarily mean that we are having unreasonable expectations for our students. But it also doesn't mean smooth sailing either, right? It means we're going to have to put in the hard work to find ways to make content accessible to students. As the scaffold shows, it may be quite a lot of work that we have to put in to hold up our students and get them where we want them to be. But if we believe that we can provide that support to them, our students really can be successful. So presuming competence isn't just something you say you do and then you kind of go on about your business. You presume the competence, but then you do the work to structure and scaffold everything that goes on around that student, their educational programming and the communication that you have with them, and basing that on that assumption. There is some competence and some ability in there. It's hard work. It won't be perfect. And there's unfortunately no prescribed method or procedure that we can follow that will guarantee the outcomes that we want. But that hard work of sort of digging through all that is on us. Our students depend on us to make their education accessible to them. So having high expectations is one way that we go about that. I just wanted to thank you all for hanging in there with me and listening to this webinar about having high expectations, presuming competence in our students with significant disabilities. If you'd like more information on ways to do this, or if you want to go further in your learning about presuming competence and holding high expectations for your students, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Project Success. Our website is www.projectsuccessindiana.com. Hope you have a great day. Thanks.